Welcome to the Logic Videos. I'm Scott Aiken. This is Logic Basics number 3. In this video, I'm going to talk about levels of validity, levels of assessing or articulating what validity is, and the top level, semantic and syntactic notions of validity. So let's start with just that basic notion of what validity is. The valid arguments, for the most part, or not just for the most part, valid arguments are arguments where the truth of the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion. There are no instances where the premises are true and the conclusion's false. So one way to start to think about validity is to think of valid arguments as instances of valid forms. So the ground level way of thinking of a valid argument is an instance or a type of a valid token. So again, we can imagine that we've got arguments that take this form, and an argument that takes that form, one or the other, not one so the other, that form works regardless of whatever you're talking about. And so any argument, you fill in whatever these A's and B's are, the constant is the or and the not, right? And that's the form that that argument takes. And regardless of whatever you're talking about, that's what makes the argument valid. The form is the explanation as to why it makes it valid. So ground level one, a valid argument is an argument that instantiates a valid form. We see this, for example, the definition from Klink's Understanding Formal Logic. That's the place to start. Start with the logical forms and then start building up. Okay, so now the next level is, okay, ground level is, the ground level of validity is a valid argument instantiates a valid form. Well, what makes a valid form? Okay, now valid forms are forms where the truth of your input premises guarantees the truth of the output conclusion, or there are no instances, or it's not possible for these two to be true and for this one to be false. Now, the question then is, how in the world are we able to get those kind of guarantees, right? Where does that guarantee come from? That's the other way to ask that question. Or how do we distinguish between arguments that have that guarantee and ones that don't? Or how can we explain that guarantee? And that's the last level of formal logic, this semantic and syntactic notions of validity, being able to make explicit and say, look, it just seems obvious that the truth of these premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion. But what we want to do is crack open what's obvious, look inside and see that there's all sorts of stuff happening inside. And that the stuff that's happening inside this little piece of reasoning is also stuff that's happening inside of lots of other very obvious pieces of reasoning. And we can make that systematic and make it so that they all work together and share a deeper explanation. Okay? So that's the other part of logic. We're not just looking at being able to detect good reasoning, we also want to be able to explain what's good about it or what's bad about it. Okay, so we've got those three levels, right? We've got the ground level, valid arguments instantiate valid forms. What's a valid form? A valid form are instances where it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. The last level is the explanation for that. There are two ways that we are able to detect and explain how we get that guarantee. Let's start with what's sometimes called the semantic model. Well, let's just start with just the thought behind the semantic model. So again, if I have A or B, and I have not B, I get A. One thought here is that because these words mean something, right? So if I were to explain it, I'd say something like A or B, not B, so A. The change in that vocabulary, the change in the way that I say those words indicates the fact that there's something about the meaning of those words. And the important thing is that it's the meaning of those words, because those words mean what they do, that they've got this very special relationship with each other. And so once we see that there's something about the meaning of or and the meaning of not, now we're able to say it's because the words mean what they mean, we have an explanation as to why the inference is good. Okay? So that's the big thought behind what you might call semantic validity is. What's semantic validity? Well, it's effectively that the guarantee is rooted in the meanings of the terms around which we reason. Here's the formal definition of it. Let's start with the first half of this. An argument A is semantically valid in a logic L. So the first thing to note is that the explanations are going to be indexed to logics, because the logics are going to be, the way that we start off in the logics is explaining the meanings of those terms around which we reason. If and only if, because that's how definitions are done, if and only if, so it's not possible, given the semantics of that logic, for A's premises to be true and for the conclusion to be false. So the crucial thing with semantic validity is that what we have is a systematic representation of the meanings of the terms around which we reason. Once we have those systematic representations, we now have an explanation how we get that guarantee. In the next couple of videos, we're going to be assembling the semantics of a logic, in particular the logic of propositional logic, and once we have that semantics, we will then be able to show how that guarantee happens. Okay, so that's level one. Level one, that's the first half of level 3. Semantics of a logic. It's because the terms mean something. But one of the things that I wanted you to see was that because those forms are repeatable and they show up all over the place, it looks like what you can do is you can say, I'm seeing this form, I don't need to go back to these meanings and things like that. I can just sort of automatically do it. I can make it a rule. And that's the next thought. That good thinking is a rule-bound thinking. And so what we need to be able to do is, on the one hand, be able to see that we've got good forms, but once we see that they're good forms, we can make them rules. And we can just use those rules as rules of justification. So the next way of thinking about validity is in terms of being able to get from the premises to the conclusion according to rules that guarantee validity. So that's what syntactic validity is. It's a rule-bound, derivational validity. So, an argument is syntactically valid in a logic. So far, very similar to the other one. If and only if, and here's the next part, and this makes syntactic validity a very different kind of functional thing from semantic validity. If A's conclusion is derivable that its conclusion is derivable from its premises according to a logic's rules. Once we have a set of rules assembled, we then can be able to do what's sometimes called a proof. That we can take the premises and think our way through them, applying rules that we know for sure are good, that will always guarantee the truth of what their output is, and as a consequence be able to derive various conclusions. So that last level of validity, so again, ground level of validity is that an argument is valid when it instantiates a valid form. Second level, what makes a valid form? The truth of the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion, given the form of it, given the form that the argument takes. The third level of validity takes has got sort of two lenses we look at it through. The first lens is the semantic model, which is that it's the meaning of the terms around which we reason, and because of a systematic way of looking at that meaning, the semantics of a logic, we can then show how the guarantee happens. Once we have got those forms figured out according to the semantics, we then have a syntax, a set of rules that we can then articulate what syntactic validity is. Syntactic validity is, again, the systematic way of being able to derive conclusions from premises using particular rules that we know for sure are good. This class is really going to have two faces then. We're going to have a semantic face to these logics, and looking at our reasoning through this semantic lens, being able to represent the meanings and then show the guarantees. And then once we've got those guarantees and those meanings in place, we then will have some rules to be able to do the derivations in the form of proofs.